Every morning at 5:30 a.m., David Johnson walked through the back entrance of Technocore Industries, his worn-out sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floors. The security guard barely looked up from his newspaper as David swiped his badge and headed to the supply closet. 3 years of this routine, and he might as well have been invisible. David wasn't supposed to be here. Not like this, anyway. With his engineering degree from State University tucked away in a folder at home, he should have been designing systems, solving problems, making a difference. Instead, he was pushing a mop cart through hallways where million-dollar decisions were made daily. The morning shift started with the executive floors. David had learned to time his cleaning perfectly, arriving just as the first wave of suits and ties flooded in with their coffee cups and important phone calls. He moved like a ghost between them, emptying trash cans and wiping down surfaces, while conversations about market strategies and quarterly reports swirled around him. Nobody ever looked at him. Not really. He was part of the furniture, as invisible as the security cameras mounted in the corners. Sometimes a polite executive might nod or mumble a quick good morning, but most walked past like he didn't exist at all. David didn't mind being invisible, though. It gave him time to think, to observe, to remember what it felt like when his brain was engaged with real problems instead of soap dispensers and window streaks. During his lunch breaks, he'd sit in his car and sketch out ideas for the engineering challenges he overheard in the hallways. Old habits die hard. The hardest part wasn't the physical work. David had grown up helping his father with construction jobs every summer, so his hands were used to labor. The hardest part was watching highly paid consultants struggle with problems he could probably solve in his sleep. But who was he to speak up? Just the guy who cleaned their offices at home. David's wife, Lisa, never complained, but he could see the worry in her eyes when she looked at their monthly bills. Their daughter, Amy, was starting high school next year, and college would come fast. After that, the custodial job paid enough to cover their basic needs. But there wasn't much left over for dreams. David had been an engineer for 8 years before the layoffs hit. The company he worked for had been swallowed up by a bigger corporation, and suddenly his department was redundant. He'd spent months sending out resumes, going to interviews, explaining why a 42-year-old engineer was worth hiring when fresh graduates would work for half the salary. The rejections came politely at first, then stopped coming altogether. His savings account got smaller each month. The mortgage payment stayed the same. When a friend mentioned that Technocore was hiring custodial staff with good benefits, David swallowed his pride and applied. It was supposed to be temporary, just until something better came along. 3 years later, he was still there. The irony wasn't lost on him. Every day, he cleaned the offices of people doing exactly what he used to do. He emptied the trash cans of engineers who made more in a month than he made in a year. He wiped down the whiteboards where million-dollar problems were, sketched out in dry erase marker. But David had learned something interesting about being invisible. People said things around him they'd never say in front of someone they considered an equal. He'd overheard budget meetings, strategy sessions, and crisis discussions that would have been classified information to an outsider. The executives talked freely while he worked, as if he were just another piece of office equipment. That's how David first learned about Project Phoenix. It started with whispered conversations in the break room, then heated phone calls in offices. He was cleaning. Soon, entire meetings were dedicated to this mysterious project that was apparently costing the company a fortune. David didn't know the details, but he could feel the tension building with each passing week. The word crisis came up more and more often. So did emergency meetings and board pressure. David had worked in corporate environments long enough to know what those phrases meant. Jobs were on the line. Maybe thousands of them. As the weeks turned into months, David watched the stress levels climb. Executives who used to joke around in the hallways now walked with their heads down, checking their phones constantly. The consultant meetings became more frequent. The trash cans filled up with discarded reports and failed solutions. David found himself paying closer attention to the fragments of conversation he caught while working. His engineering mind couldn't help but analyze the pieces of information floating around. Whatever Project Phoenix was, it involved manufacturing, automation, and a lot of very expensive equipment that wasn't working properly. Sometimes late at night, when the building was almost empty, David would walk past the main production floor. Through the glass windows, he could see massive machines sitting silent and dark. Millions of dollars worth of equipment just sitting there like sleeping giants. The overnight security guard mentioned that the production line had been shut down for months. Bleeding money every day it stayed offline. David started timing his cleaning route to coincide with the crisis meetings. Not because he was trying to eavesdrop, but because those were the rooms that needed the most attention afterward. Stress made people messy. Coffee spills, scattered papers, forgotten sandwiches. The aftermath of panic was always the same. One evening, as David was emptying the trash in the main conference room, he overheard a conversation that made him stop in his tracks. The CEO herself was on a conference call, discussing the possibility of plant closures and massive layoffs if Project Phoenix couldn't be fixed soon. "We've brought in every expert we can find," she was saying to whoever was on the other end of the line. Métis consultants, industry specialists, automation engineers from Germany. 8 months and $20 million later, we're no closer to a solution than when we started. David's hands froze on the trash bag. $20 million. 8 months of failures. And from what he could piece together from the technical terms being thrown around, the problem sounded like something he might actually understand, but he was just the custodian. The invisible man who cleaned up after the real problem solvers? What could he possibly contribute to a crisis that had stumped the best minds money could buy? That night, David went home and pulled out his old engineering textbooks for the first time in 3 years. He might be invisible during the day, but his mind was still sharp. Maybe it was time to start paying even closer attention to those hallway conversations. After all, sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes being invisible is the perfect position to see what everyone else is missing. The boardroom felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. CEO Rebecca Chun sat at the head of the massive oak table, her usually perfect composure cracking under 8 months of relentless failure. Dark circles under her eyes told the story of countless sleepless nights, and her hands trembled slightly as she shuffled through yet another disappointing report. Around the table sat 12 of the most powerful people in the company, vice presidents, department heads, and board members, who collectively earned more in bonuses than most small towns saw in tax revenue. But today, all their money and influence couldn't solve the nightmare that was slowly destroying everything they'd built. Project Phoenix was supposed to be their crown jewel, a completely automated production line that would revolutionize manufacturing and put Technocore decades ahead of their competition. 2 years in development, hundreds of millions invested, and promises made to shareholders that now felt like death sentences. Instead, they had the most expensive pile of metal and circuits in corporate history. The production line would run perfectly for hours, sometimes even days, and then suddenly shut down without warning. No error codes, no obvious malfunctions, just complete system failure that left everyone scratching their heads. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca began, her voice hoarse from stress, "we're gathered here for what might be our final attempt to save this project, and frankly, to save our jobs." The room fell silent except for the nervous shuffling of papers. Everyone knew the stakes. The board had made it crystal clear during last week's emergency meeting. Fix Project Phoenix or face the consequences, plant closures, mass layoffs, possible bankruptcy. Dr. Patterson from MIT leaned forward, adjusting his expensive glasses. He'd been brought in 6 months ago with promises of revolutionary solutions and breakthrough thinking. His consulting firm had charged $3 million for what turned out to be educated guesswork. "We've run every diagnostic test known to modern engineering," he said, his voice defensive. "The hardware is perfect. The software is flawless. On paper, this system should run for years without a single hiccup." "But it doesn't," Rebecca replied sharply. "On paper doesn't pay our bills or keep our workers employed." Michael Torres, the head of engineering, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd been with the company for 15 years, rising through the ranks on technical skill and innovative thinking. Now he felt like a complete failure. "We've replaced every major component at least twice," Michael said. "New sensors, updated processors, completely rewritten control algorithms. We've brought in specialists from Germany, Japan, and Silicon Valley. Everyone agrees the design is brilliant." "Brilliant designs that don't work aren't brilliant," snapped board member Janet Morrison. "They're expensive disasters." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Careers were ending, reputations were being destroyed, and somewhere in the back of everyone's mind was the knowledge that 12,000 employees were counting on them to figure this out. David Johnson pushed his cleaning cart past the boardroom windows, moving as quietly as possible. He'd learned to time his route perfectly, arriving just as these crisis meetings were reaching their peak intensity. Not because he enjoyed watching powerful people suffer, but because these rooms always needed extra attention afterward. Stress made people careless. Coffee cups left half full on expensive tables. Important documents scattered and forgotten. Sometimes even laptops left open with sensitive information glowing on their screens. David had seen enough corporate meltdowns to know the pattern. Through the thick glass, he could see Rebecca pacing at the front of the room while charts and graphs flashed on the massive display screen. Even without hearing the words, David could read the body language: slumped shoulders, frustrated gestures. The universal signs of smart people running out of options dot inside the room. The meeting was spiraling into finger-pointing and blame games. The automation specialists insisted the mechanical systems were perfect. The software engineers swore their code was bug-free. The electrical team had triple-checked every circuit and connection. "Maybe we need to admit this project is beyond current technology," suggested Dr. Patterson. "Sometimes innovation requires accepting temporary failure." The room erupted in angry voices. Temporary failure wasn't an option when the company was bleeding money at the rate of $300,000 per day. Shareholders were demanding answers. Competitors were circling like vultures. The media had already started running stories about Technocore's Phantom Factory. Rebecca held up her hand for silence. "We've spent over $20 million on consulting fees alone. We've brought in experts from every corner of the engineering world." "Are you telling me that?" "The combined intelligence of everyone in this room, plus dozens of outside specialists, can't solve one manufacturing problem." "It's not just one problem," Michael replied quietly. "It's like the system has a ghost in it. Everything works perfectly until it doesn't. No warnings, no patterns we can identify, no logic to the failures." David paused outside the door, pretending to organize his cleaning supplies while he listened. Ghost in the system, random failures with no apparent pattern. His engineering brain started turning over the possibilities almost automatically. Back inside, the meeting had devolved into desperate brainstorming. Ideas that would have been laughed out of the room 6 months ago were now being seriously considered. Supernatural explanations, sabotage theories, even suggestions that the building itself might be cursed. What if we scrapped the whole thing and start over? Asked Janet Morrison. Cut our losses and move on. The silence that followed was deafening. Starting over would mean admitting complete defeat. It would also mean explaining to shareholders how they'd managed to waste over $100 million on a project that never worked. Rebecca looked around the table at faces that had once radiated confidence and ambition. Now they looked like survivors of a natural disaster, shell-shocked and defeated. "Starting over isn't an option," she said firmly. "We find a solution, or we find new jobs. Those are the only two choices." Outside in the hallway, David finished organizing his cart and moved on to the next office. But his mind stayed focused on what he'd overheard. A system that worked perfectly until it suddenly didn't. Failures with no apparent pattern or cause. Engineers and specialists stumped by a problem that seemed to defy logic. He'd seen similar issues before, back in his engineering days. Systems that appeared flawless on paper but failed in real-world conditions due to factors nobody had considered. Environmental variables, interference patterns, simple interactions between complex systems that created unexpected results. As David cleaned the offices around the boardroom, he could hear the meeting continuing late into the evening. Voices raised in frustration, phone calls to even more expensive consultants, the desperate sounds of brilliant people running out of time and options. By 10 o'clock, the meeting finally ended. David watched through the windows as exhausted executives filed out of the room, their faces grim with the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of failure and mounting pressure. Rebecca was the last to leave, standing alone at the head of the empty table, staring at the charts and graphs that told the story of her company's potential destruction. David had never seen someone look so completely defeated. As he entered the empty boardroom to clean up the aftermath of another failed crisis meeting, David couldn't shake the feeling that the solution might be simpler than anyone imagined. Sometimes, the most complex problems had surprisingly simple causes, but he was just the custodian. What did he know about million-dollar manufacturing systems? More than anyone realized, as it turned out. The clock on the factory wall read 11:47 p.m. when David noticed something that would change everything. He'd been working the night shift for 3 weeks now, taking on extra hours to help pay for his daughter's school supplies. The building was nearly empty except for security guards and the occasional engineer pulling an all-nighter. David pushed his cart down the main corridor toward the production floor, the same route he'd taken hundreds of times before. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the complete silence, or maybe it was the way the moonlight streamed through the massive windows, casting long shadows across the dormant machinery. The project Phoenix production line stretched out before him like a sleeping giant. Millions of dollars worth of cutting-edge technology, all sitting perfectly still. During the day, teams of engineers swarmed over these machines like ants, checking connections, running diagnostics, scratching their heads in confusion. At night, the equipment looked almost peaceful, as if it was just waiting for someone to figure out its secret. David had been thinking about the problem for weeks now, not officially, of course. Just the natural curiosity of an engineer who couldn't turn off his brain, even while mopping floors. The random shutdowns, the lack of error codes, the way the system would run perfectly for hours before suddenly stopping, it reminded him of a puzzle he'd encountered years ago at his old job. As he cleaned the observation windows that overlooked the production floor, David felt the familiar blast of cold air from the building's ventilation system. The HVAC unit was cycling on, just like it did every hour throughout the day and night. The building's climate control was incredibly sophisticated, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity levels for the sensitive equipment. That's when it hit him. David stopped cleaning and stood perfectly still, his mind racing through the possibilities. The VAGA system cycled every hour. The production line failures seemed random, but what if they weren't? What if there was a pattern that nobody had thought to look for? He pulled out his phone and opened the Notes app, fingers flying across the screen as he tried to capture his thoughts before they slipped away. For the past 3 weeks, he'd been unconsciously noting the times when he heard about system failures. Emergency meetings called at 2:15 p.m., frustrated phone calls at 9:30 a.m., crisis discussions at 4:45 p.m., all roughly 1 hour apart. David's heart started pounding as the pieces began falling into place. His engineering background kicked into high gear, and suddenly he was thinking like the problem solver he used to be, not just the custodian he'd become. Temperature fluctuations. That's what his gut was telling him. The VEA system was designed to maintain perfect climate control, but perfect was relative. Even the most sophisticated systems had tiny variations, maybe a degree or two as the system cycled on and off. For most equipment, those tiny changes would be meaningless. But modern manufacturing systems used incredibly sensitive sensors, components that could detect variations measured in thousandths of degrees. If those sensors were calibrated too precisely, even normal temperature fluctuations could trigger false readings. David abandoned his cleaning cart and walked closer to the production line, studying the massive machines through the safety glass. Somewhere in that maze of metal and circuits was a sensor array that was probably doing exactly what it was designed to do, shutting down the system when it detected conditions outside its programmed parameters. The problem wasn't that the system was broken. The problem was that it was working too well. David spent the next 2 hours walking around the production floor, observing details that dozens of high-paid consultants had missed. He noticed how the air vents were positioned relative to the main sensor clusters. He observed the way temperature readings fluctuated on the digital displays mounted throughout the area. He even timed the HVAC cycles and compared them to his mental notes about system failures. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The temperature variations were microscopic, probably less than half a degree, but they were enough to trigger the ultra-sensitive sensor array. When the building's climate control system cycled on, it created tiny air currents that changed the temperature around the sensors for just a few minutes, long enough to register as an error condition and shut down the entire production line. The solution was breathtakingly simple. Adjust the sensor calibration to allow for normal temperature variations. Install basic thermal shields around the most sensitive components. Total cost, maybe $500 in materials and a few hours of work, but David wasn't done yet. He needed to be absolutely certain before he did anything that could cost him his job. Over the next 3 nights, he conducted his own informal research project. He timed the HVAC cycles precisely. He noted every system shutdown he heard about through office gossip. He even asked the security guards about the timing of recent failures, claiming he was just curious about all the commotion. The pattern was undeniable. Every single system failure occurred within 10 minutes of an IVAC cycle. The correlation was so perfect it would have been obvious to anyone who thought to look for it. But nobody had thought to look. The experts were focused on complex software bugs, hardware malfunctions, and sophisticated engineering problems. They'd never considered something as simple as air conditioning. By the end of the week, David had filled a notebook with observations, timing charts, and technical sketches. His engineering mind was fully engaged for the first time in 3 years, and it felt incredible. He'd forgotten how much he loved solving problems, the satisfaction of finding elegant solutions to complex challenges. But now came the hard part. What was he supposed to do with this information? David was just the night custodian. He had no official standing in the company, no engineering credentials that anyone knew about, no reason for anyone to take him seriously. If he was wrong, he'd look like a fool. If he was right but handled it badly, he might still get fired. For overstepping his boundaries, he thought about his wife, Lisa, and their daughter Amy, the steady paycheck that kept their family afloat, the health insurance that covered Amy's asthma medication, the college fund they were slowly building for her future. Was he really willing to risk all of that on a hunch about air conditioning? But then David thought about the 12,000 employees who worked at Technocore, the families who depended on paychecks from the company, the communities that would be devastated if the plant closed, the ripple effect of unemployment that would spread far beyond the factory walls. He also thought about Rebecca Chan, the CEO, who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, the engineers who were questioning their own competence, the board members who were probably planning mass layoffs, all of them struggling with a problem that might have an incredibly simple solution. David made his decision on a Friday night, alone in the empty factory with nothing but his thoughts and the quiet hum of machinery. He would find a way to share his theory, regardless of the personal risk. He owed it to everyone, his coworkers, his family, and himself, to at least try. Or all. The worst thing that could happen was that he'd be wrong. But what if he was right? What if 3 years of being invisible had put him in the perfect position to see what everyone else had missed? Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from the smallest observations. And sometimes the person with the clearest view is the one nobody expects to be looking. David's hands wouldn't stop shaking as he sat at his kitchen table at 5:30 a.m., staring at the blank email on his laptop screen. His wife Lisa was still asleep upstairs, and their daughter Amy wouldn't be up for another hour. The house was perfectly quiet except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and the sound of his nervous breathing. He'd been sitting there for 45 minutes, typing and deleting the same email over and over again. How do you tell the CEO of a Fortune 500 company that you think you've solved a $100 million problem? How do you explain that the night custodian has figured out what teams of MIT engineers couldn't? The cursor blinked mockingly at him from the empty message box. David rubbed his tired eyes and tried to imagine how this would sound to someone like Rebecca Shun. She probably received hundreds of emails every day from important people with important ideas. Why would she pay attention to a message from David Johnson, employee ID number 47,291, custodial services? But he had to try. 3 sleepless nights of research had convinced him beyond any doubt that he was right. The pattern was too perfect to be coincidence. The solution was too elegant to ignore, and the stakes were too high to let his fear get in the way. David took a deep breath and started typing again. This time, he forced himself to keep going no matter how crazy it sounded. "Dear Miss Chun," he began, then stopped and deleted it, too formal. He tried again. "Hello, my name is David Johnson, and I work as a custodian on the night shift at Technocore. I know this might sound strange coming from someone in my position, but I believe I've identified the cause of the Project Phoenix failures." His fingers moved faster now, muscle memory from his engineering days taking over. He described his observations about the HVAC cycles and temperature fluctuations. He explained the sensor calibration theory in precise technical language, using terms he hadn't spoken out loud in 3 years. He included timing charts and diagrams he'd sketched during his research. When he finished, the email was 3 pages long and filled with technical details that proved he wasn't just guessing. David read it through twice, checking for typos and making sure his explanations were clear. Then he sat back and stared at the send button. This was it. The moment that would either change his life or end his job. There was no middle ground here. Once he sent this email, there would be no going back. David thought about his old engineering professor who used to say that knowledge without action was just expensive trivia. He thought about the thousands of families who would suffer if the plant closed. He thought about Rebecca Shun's exhausted face during that boardroom meeting, and how she'd looked like she was carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. At 6:15 a.m. David clicked send, then he closed the laptop, got dressed for work, and tried to pretend his heart wasn't pounding like a drum in his chest. The morning shift started like any other day. David arrived at the usual time, checked in with security, and began his cleaning routine. But everything felt different now. Every executive who walked past him made him wonder if they'd heard about his email. Every phone conversation made him think. Someone was discussing the crazy custodian who thought he could solve engineering problems. By 10 a.m., David was convinced his email had been deleted or ignored. Rebecca Chun probably received hundreds of messages from employees every week. Most of them probably ended up in some assistant's spam folder without ever being read, but at 10:47 a.m., everything changed. David was cleaning the third-floor bathrooms when his supervisor, Tom Martinez, found him. Tom looked confused and slightly worried, like he wasn't sure if David was in trouble or had won the lottery. "Hey, David," Tom said, "I just got a weird call from upstairs. Apparently the CEO wants to see you in her office right now." David's mop fell from his hands and clattered on the tile floor. "The CEO? Are you sure they meant me?" They asked for David Johnson from Custodial Services. "Unless there's another David Johnson I don't know about, that's you." Tom studied David's face carefully. "You didn't do anything wrong, did you? Steal something or break some expensive equipment?" "No, nothing like that," David managed to say, though his voice sounded strange even to himself. "Well, whatever it is, you better get up there fast." They said it was urgent. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt like it lasted forever. David caught a glimpse of himself in the polished steel doors and realized he was still wearing his custodial uniform. His work shirt had a small stain from where he'd spilled coffee earlier, and his name tag was crooked. This was how he was going to meet the CEO of the company. Rebecca Shun's office was on the top floor, behind massive wooden doors that David had only seen from the outside while cleaning the hallway. Her assistant, a professional-looking woman in an expensive suit, glanced up from her computer with barely concealed surprise. "You must be David Johnson," she said, her tone suggesting this was the most unusual appointment she'd ever scheduled. "Miss Chun is waiting for you, but I have to warn you, she only has a few minutes before her next meeting." David nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The assistant knocked on the office door and opened it just enough to stick her head inside. "Miss Chun? David Johnson from Custodial Services is here." "Send him in," came the reply from inside. Rebecca Chun's office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The CEO herself was standing behind her desk, reading something on her computer screen. She looked up as David entered, and he was struck by how tired she appeared up close. The stress of the past few months had clearly taken its toll. "Mr. Johnson," she said, gesturing to a chair in front of her desk. "Please sit down." David perched nervously on the edge of the leather chair, feeling completely out of place in the luxurious office. Rebecca sat down across from him and leaned forward, her expression intense but not unfriendly. "I received your email this morning," she said, "and I have to admit, it's the most interesting theory anyone has presented about Project Phoenix. But I need to ask you something directly. How does a custodian know enough about automated manufacturing systems to diagnose a problem that stumped our best engineers?" This was the moment David had been dreading, the moment when he'd have to explain how he'd ended up pushing a mop instead of designing systems. He took a deep breath and decided to tell the truth. "I have a degree in mechanical engineering from State University," he said quietly. "I worked as a design engineer for 8 years before the layoffs hit. I've been in custodial services for 3 years now, but I never stopped thinking like an engineer." Rebecca's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "You're an engineer?" "Was an engineer," David corrected. Nobody wanted to hire a middle-aged engineer when they could get someone fresh out of college for half the salary. For a long moment, Rebecca just stared at him, and David was sure he'd made a terrible mistake. Then slowly, she began to smile. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I think you and I need to take a walk down to the production floor." The walk to the production floor felt like a dream to David. Rebecca Chun strode beside him through corridors he'd cleaned hundreds of times, but now he was seeing them from a completely different perspective. Employees stopped and stared as the CEO walked past with the night custodian, whispers following in their wake like ripples on a pond dot when they reached the production floor. Rebecca called over the head engineer, Michael Torres, who looked confused and slightly panicked at seeing his boss accompanied by someone in a custodial uniform. "Michael," Rebecca said, "I want you to listen to Mr. Johnson's theory about the system failures. And I want you to listen with an open mind." For the next 20 minutes, David explained his observations about the HVAC cycles and temperature fluctuations. He pointed out the sensor locations, traced the airflow patterns, and demonstrated how tiny temperature variations could trigger false error readings. Michael's expression gradually changed from skepticism to amazement as the theory began to make perfect sense. "It's so simple," Michael whispered, running his hands through his hair. "We'd been looking for complex problems when the answer was right in front of us the whole time." Within 2 hours, the engineering team had confirmed David's diagnosis. The sensor calibration was adjusted by exactly 0.03 degrees, and basic thermal shields were installed around the most sensitive components. The total cost, $467. 3:15 p.m. that same day, Project Phoenix came back online. The massive production line hummed to life for the first time in 8 months, running smoothly through multiple HVAC cycles without a single shutdown. The problem that had consumed millions of dollars and months of effort was finally solved, but what Rebecca Shun did next sent shockwaves through the entire company and eventually the business world itself. Instead of offering David a small bonus or a simple promotion, Rebecca called an emergency all-hands meeting for 4 p.m., the main auditorium filled with confused employees who had no idea why they'd been summoned on such short notice. Rebecca took the stage and began to tell the story of how their $100 million crisis had been solved by someone they'd all overlooked. She explained David's background, his observations, and the elegant simplicity of his solution. But she didn't stop there. "Today I learned something that should embarrass all of us," Rebecca said, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed auditorium. "We had a brilliant engineer working in our building for 3 years, and we never knew it. David Johnson wasn't invisible because he chose to be. He was invisible because we chose not to see him." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "This company nearly failed because we assumed that intelligence and innovation only existed in certain departments, at certain levels, wearing certain clothes. We were so busy looking up for solutions that we forgot to look around us." Rebecca gestured for David to join her on stage. He walked up slowly, still wearing his custodial uniform, still feeling like this couldn't possibly be real. The applause started small but grew until the entire auditorium was on their feet, cheering for the custodian who had saved their jobs. "Effective immediately," Rebecca announced, "David Johnson is our new Chief Innovation Officer. But more importantly, we're implementing what I'm calling the Innovation Access Protocol. Every employee, regardless of position or department, will have a direct channel to submit ideas and suggestions. We're also creating monthly forums where anyone can present solutions to company challenges." The audience erupted in approval, but Rebecca wasn't finished. "We're also launching the Second Chance Scholarship Program," she continued. "Any employee who wants to pursue additional education or training will receive full company support. And we're partnering with local colleges to identify and hire talented people who might have been overlooked by traditional recruitment methods." The following weeks, the transformation at Technocore was remarkable. The story of David's discovery spread beyond the company walls, picked up by business magazines and news outlets. Harvard Business School reached out to study the case as an example of overlooked human capital in corporate environments. David's first day as Chief Innovation Officer was surreal. He traded his custodial uniform for business clothes and moved into a corner office with the same view he used to clean windows to see. But the real change wasn't in his title or salary. It was in how people saw him and how he saw himself. The Innovation Access Protocol that Rebecca had announced yielded immediate results. Within the first month, employees submitted over 300 ideas for improving operations, reducing costs, and solving problems. A maintenance worker suggested a simple modification that increased equipment efficiency by 12%. A cafeteria employee proposed a waste reduction program that saved the company $50,000 annually. A security guard identified a safety issue that prevented a potential accident. David's story resonated far beyond Technocore. Other companies began examining their own assumptions about where innovation could come from. The phrase, invisible engineer, became corporate shorthand for overlooked talent within organizations. 6 months later, Technocore's stock price had increased by 42%. The successful launch of Project Phoenix, combined with the company's new reputation for inclusive innovation, attracted investors and top talent from around the industry. Orders poured in from companies that wanted the revolutionary manufacturing system that had almost been abandoned, but perhaps the most meaningful change was in the company culture itself. The rigid hierarchy that had kept David invisible began to dissolve. Meetings included voices from every level of the organization. Decision-making became more collaborative and creative. The cafeteria buzzed with conversations between engineers and maintenance staff, executives, and administrative assistants. David's family life transformed as well. The financial stress that had weighed on them for 3 years disappeared overnight. More importantly, Amy saw her father return to the work he loved, proving that setbacks could become comebacks with persistence and courage. Lisa often told friends that the most amazing part wasn't David's promotion or salary increase, it was watching him rediscover his passion and confidence after years of feeling invisible. 1 year after the crisis, David stood in the same production facility where he'd once pushed a mop, but now he was giving a tour to a group of business students. The massive machines hummed efficiently in the background, no longer plagued by mysterious shutdowns. The most important lesson, David told the students, isn't about engineering or problem solving. It's about the value of every person in an organization. Innovation doesn't only happen in research labs or boardrooms. Sometimes the best solutions come from the people who see things differently because they stand in different places. Rebecca Chun often used David's story in her speaking engagements at business conferences. She would tell audiences that finding David wasn't just about solving one problem. It was about recognizing that talent exists everywhere, often hidden in plain sight. The custodian who saved the company had done more than fix a manufacturing line. He'd proven that everyone has something valuable to contribute if only someone takes the time to listen. In a world obsessed with credentials and hierarchies, David's story became a powerful reminder that the next breakthrough might come from the most unexpected source. Sometimes the person with the best view of the solution is the one everyone assumes isn't looking.